Do you want to do a little kickoff intro, Saeed?
Yes, definitely. I thank everyone for coming in on Thursday night. I know there is a lot to do, especially in the winter time, but we take in the time and we are extremely grateful for Dave Randall to come and be with us tonight. Dave is a product manager for Microsoft Intune. Um, Dave is focused on IT automation right now, Graph and PowerShell, and definitely I would love to host you another time, Dave, for a PowerShell automation session for Intune and ConfigMan whenever you're ready. But we are all anxious and looking forward for your presentation. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, Saeed. Thank you for the welcome, and I'm really glad to be here. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time out of your evening to join and talk a little bit about APIs, Microsoft Graph, and Intune automation. My assumption is that we're going to start at ground zero. There may be some information in here that's repetitive for some of you if you've gone down the path of learning a little bit about the different automation options, but I wanted to make sure that this was a great bit of content that was available for people who hadn't had the opportunity to understand and learn about what automation and APIs are available for Intune. So we're going to cover some basics across all of the different capabilities that we'll talk about, and we'll dive into looking at about as close to code as we're going to get to today. We won't necessarily be going through code, but we'll get real close to it so you can understand really how the Graph APIs behave and how they interact with Intune. So with that, let's first start out with an overview of the different API sets that are available for you as an Intune consumer. So I assume you have one or more Intune tenants in your organization, and there's a bunch of different APIs that are available for you to use. So the first group are publicly accessible APIs, and obviously we're going to talk the majority of our time about the Microsoft Graph-based APIs. But there's also a Microsoft Graph SDK. So if you're doing application development, you can include that SDK in your build environment and have access to the APIs in a much more native fashion. And then we have app protection policies. So if you're an application developer, and by application, I mean, pretty much an iOS or Android application developer, and you've got something that you're either selling, or maybe if you're developing that as an internal line of business application, you want to be able to apply app protection policies from Intune to your applications. And so the MAM SDK is another set of APIs that are available for you to consume so that your application is both aware of all of the Intune policies that get deployed and also gives you some benefits of things like single sign-on. From the PowerShell perspective, there's a couple of different ways that you can consume PowerShell for Intune. The first is, and I'll admit it's a relatively old PowerShell Intune module. Back when Intune, for those of you who have been around Intune for a while, you might remember the Intune Silverlight console. There was a point in time that we decided we were going to move off the Silverlight console and onto the Azure Portal platform. And at that same time, we also decided we were going to put a middle tier API layer, and that was the Microsoft Graph layer. And so that meant that we were going to have an API, but I knew from my time in Configuration Manager that many of you as IT pros prefer to use PowerShell rather than just kind of a raw API and build an application around it. So the Intune team built a module where we looked at all of the schema for everything that we exposed in Graph, and we built the PowerShell module around that. So anything that was exposed as a Graph API got exposed as an Intune-based PowerShell commandlet. And we did a release of that module, we did 1 or 2 little updates, and then, to be honest with you, it's been sitting on the shelf for the past couple of years. And part of the reason why is because the next line is the direct result of the work that the Intune team to use the Graph SDK as the basis for generating, in an automated fashion, generating a PowerShell module. So the Graph team have picked up that code that we built, and they have now built a Microsoft Graph SDK-based PowerShell module. So what that means is that any of the APIs that are exposed in Microsoft Graph are now exposed through this Microsoft Graph PowerShell module. And that's inclusive of all of the things that are in Intune. So going forward, that's where the investment area is, both from the Graph team and Intune, in terms of a specific PowerShell module that gives you the ability to automate actions or retrieve data from Intune using PowerShell. Going back a little bit again in history, the next item, the sample script GitHub repo, is something that one of my coworkers, David Falkus, and we realized again that there was a real need for having some examples of how to use these Graph APIs. And because most everybody was familiar with using PowerShell, we put together a large library of PowerShell sample scripts that demonstrate how you can use the Microsoft Graph APIs to query for information or to create objects or entities in Intune. So for all of these things, I do have pointers at the end of this. I have reference pointers, so don't worry about writing down URLs. I'll give Saeed a copy of this deck, and he can share that out with everybody. And you can find the location of the sample script GitHub repo and use those for yourself. We'll spend a little bit of time, and I'll go through them so you get you're familiar with exactly what's in the repo and how to use it. And then the next one is Microsoft 365 DSC, or desired state configuration. So one of my great friends, Nick Charlebois, who's over on the East Coast in Ottawa, he has built a desired state configuration tool for Microsoft 365, and there's a bunch of capabilities that are specific to Intune in there. And just the one-liner behind desired state is you have a set of configurations in your tenant, and you want to ensure that those configurations don't change over time, or they don't drift. And so DSC can alert you when there's a change in a configuration. For example, maybe you have a connector in Intune and somebody has changed a property on that connector, it would alert you to it. And you can also do things like transfer configuration settings from one tenant to another using DSC. So I'll again provide a pointer to the Microsoft 365 DSC. So that's all on PowerShell. And then the last one is a little more specific to usually ISVs that are interested in performing a specific type of integration with Intune. So the first one, third-party MDM compliance API, you may be a little bit more familiar with this actually as a customer to Intune, or even to some of the third-party MDMs like VMware. So there is an API that VMware and others use to send over compliance state to Intune so that we can validate and update Azure Active Directory. You may have noticed there was a blog post that came out from VMware just in the last 2 or 3 days, where they now support shared device mode for conditional access, and that's via this API. The next one is network access control. Vendors like Cisco, Aruba, Palo Alto Networks use this API to check for a device compliant state. And if the device is compliant, they'll give you an IP address or get you connected over VPN. And then the last one is a mobile threat defense API for partners like Lookouts, Imperium. They provide a risks threat level to Intune over this API so that we can correlate mobile threat defense or mobile threats that have been detected by these vendors with the device and set the compliance accordingly. So this is kind of the breadth of all of the different API sets that are available. And if you're interested, if you're a developer or partner and you're interested in any of the integration partner APIs, you can reach out directly to me. My email is david.randall@microsoft.com, and I can get you in touch with the folks that are responsible for those parties and those APIs. So, assuming that you're interested in automating Intune, there's a lot of different things that you can do, but I put together this list just to kind of at least start your mind thinking about the different types of tasks that you can automate. And I grouped them into two buckets, no particular reason, but the ongoing administrative tasks are those things that I would expect most administrators are doing on at least a weekly basis, if not maybe several times a week, or even more frequently than that. So adding or updating group membership, or performing device actions like retiring or wiping, or initiating a remote sync, or a quick or full scan, or updating malware definitions. Those are things that also typically you might do with the help desk. You might provide a tool that gives them limited visibility to Intune, but you want them to be able to perform those types of actions. So that's a good automation case. Or viewing device inventory details. Maybe the UI that we provide doesn't exactly align to your business process, and you want to be able to present that information in other UX or UI surfaces. And so using automation to retrieve that inventory information is a great use case. That's actually the most common use case that I see when I look at all of the telemetry coming back from our usage of the Graph APIs. Or you can also do things like create new applications, or deploy applications, or create and deploy new configuration profiles or compliance policies. So those are some of the common tasks that I see that are automated. And then there are some things that you might do from time to time in the infrequent operations group. And they're certainly just as automatable, but sometimes the value is a little bit less because it's something that you're only doing relatively infrequently. The one that I do really like, though, however, is viewing audit logs. And the reason why is because by default, Intune retains visibility in the console to 30 days of audit events. And I know for compliance reasons, or just for historical forensic reasons, it's a great idea to be able to offload those audit logs to a separate repository that you're maintaining, whatever tool set you may want to use. And that provides you with all of the details for as long as you want. And some of the other solutions right now from Microsoft that allow you to retrieve your audit events start to charge you for retaining those for longer than 30, 60, 90 days, whatever the policy may be. So this is something that I see a lot of customers taking advantage of as well. I have a general principle, and that is if you can do it in the console, there's a Graph API for it. So even though we went through a bunch of different examples previously to give you a sense of some of the things that I see most commonly, there's anything that you can do in the console, there's a Graph API that sits behind it. And that's almost without exception. There's, I think, one piece of data that I know of that isn't exposed in a Graph API. So the general rule is if it's in the console, there's an API for it. There's a few other things that you can do besides just the automation like we talked about, and I categorize these a little bit more in just the data access realm. So the first thing is custom reports. I won't have you all raise your hand. You probably don't find that the Intune built-in reports 100% meet your needs. I think that's one of the more common suggestions that we hear from customers is we'd really like to be able to build more customizable reports. That's extract more data, sort it differently, filter it differently, whatever the UI controls are. Sometimes they're insufficient, or you may have a huge number of devices or objects or applications, and it's difficult to use the built-in reporting system. And so custom reports are one of the most common API usages that we see. Exporting that information in a way that can then be either presented in something like Power BI, you can pull it into Excel, you can put it in whatever your favorite reporting tool is. I mentioned a little bit earlier the custom help desk tools. So one of my good friends who's been with me on this automation journey for quite a while, in the very beginning, he built a tool because he had support staff that were using both Configuration Manager and Intune. Config Manager for all their Windows devices, Intune for all their mobile devices. And he wanted to be able to just provide a single location for them to go retrieve device inventory information, perform a sync, maybe do detailed information about the last actions that were performed, or whatever those common tasks were for his tier 1 support agent. He just built a simple little UI, and he used the Graph APIs to give them just exactly what they needed to get their job done and nothing more. Many of you will use an external CMDB, like for example, ServiceNow, and you can take the information and all the data that is gathered by Intune, and you can export that out to an external CMDB. I know that there's some built-in capability, there's some add-in capabilities for ServiceNow to be able to go extract data from Intune, but it doesn't necessarily matter whether you're using ServiceNow. External CMDBs are a common way of keeping track of your asset information. I talked about audit event retention, so I'll skip that one for now. And in the compliance state, understanding whether a device is or is not compliant is a key piece of information for Zero Trust. So you may be using tools that you have built in-house, or you may be using other tools that need to understand the device compliance state and reject access for whatever it may be based on the compliance state. Not just conditional access, but like I had mentioned, the network access control looks at that compliance state. And then lastly, updating and viewing device information. You do have the ability to write back data to Intune. So if there are updated bits of information that you want to send to Intune, you can also do that via API. To give you a little overview of how the Microsoft Graph API fits in the architecture, in the large blue box across the top, we have a variety of different IT Pro experiences. So over on the left, there's all the different administrative consoles for things like SharePoint, OneDrive, Azure AD, compliance. In the middle, we have the Azure portal, for which Intune is a member of. So we have the Intune specific Azure portal extensions. We talked a little bit about the PowerShell SDK and the PowerShell module. That's another IT Pro experience. Or there can be third-party applications. Those can be applications that you build yourself as a customer, or if you're a developer, then you may be building a third-party application for sale. Or you may be doing it for fun as part of a shared community project. All of these access the Microsoft Graph API layer, and that Graph API layer provides a whole bunch of benefits to any of the different services that are connecting to it. Role-based access control ensures that the right people are accessing the information and the wrong people are not. Multi-region routing is something that I think from a cloud services perspective, we just expect, but you have a single point of entry, and Graph will automatically route your API calls to the most appropriate local region so that it maximizes your throughput and minimizes the time delays and of those API calls. Of course, we need to do denial of service detection. Our Graph service itself for Intune will also do some denial of service detections, but Graph does it at an overall Graph level, no matter what the service is, the underlying service. Microsoft gets a bunch of telemetry. There's a lot of logging that goes on. And most importantly, Graph supports both delegated and application-based authentication. So Delegated is a user plus an application, and app-only auth is just an application. So that would be commonly used if you're doing a service-to-service connection. So let's say that you have a cloud service and you want to connect and retrieve information with no interactive user, then app-only auth is available through the Graph API. That graph layer then calls into whatever the different services are that are hosting data that need to be exposed back to the IT Pro experience, whether it's Azure Active Directory or other M365 services, or Intune. So Intune in the middle is kind of broken up into a couple of pieces. One of them is a front-end service, and the Graph APIs call into that front-end service. And you remember I had mentioned the multi-region routing. Intune also has more specific routing within a region based on the location of your particular tenant. So you may be in North America and Graph will route you to North America, but Intune may specifically route you to a scale unit where your data is hosted. And then in orange in the lower right-hand corner are some other APIs that go directly to the Intune front-end service and actually don't go through Graph. So things like those vendor APIs, or the IW, apologies for the acronym there, IW stands for Information Worker in this case. And things like the Intune Company Portal use the IW service APIs to call directly to the front end of Intune to get information like what would be shown in the company portal, list of applications or devices and so forth. So that's the overall architecture of Microsoft Graph APIs. So let's dive into more detail about the APIs themselves. So the Microsoft Graph API is hosted behind a URL, graph.microsoft.com, which provides a single unified RESTful API endpoint for all of the different services. So if you think back to the past, if you were developing a service for Microsoft and you wanted to use APIs from 3 different services, you probably got 3 different source URLs, or maybe you were using SDKs, but they all were unique and oftentimes didn't have any level of consistency. So this single unified endpoint gives you consistency and a single resource for multiple Microsoft services. Because it's a graph, there are built-in relationships that are defined for all of the different objects, and relationships are queryable, so you can understand exactly what the data is. As we've been talking about, you have access to the data for any of the different services that are hosted by Microsoft Graph, and that includes a bunch of intelligence data. So not just the base information about devices, but as Microsoft builds analytics and other bits of intelligence, those get exposed as well. I covered the fact that you only have a single endpoint, so it becomes much easier. You don't have to go looking around documentation and finding all these disparate endpoints. From an authentication perspective, you get the benefit of only needing one OAuth access token for any of the services. And you don't need to re-authenticate against each of the different services. You're authenticating against Graph, and that provides you with the access token required for accessing any of the services. And this is a public API. So I talked a little bit about the underlying relationships, and things like Azure Active Directory groups or individuals or contacts. Those are tied to other bits of information in the graph, such as which document you've opened, information about the tasks that you have. Maybe there's specific content documents that are part of SharePoint. Those are tied to other pieces of information that represent activity that's happening on a regular basis, email that's being sent around, or chats that are happening. And so all of these different pieces of information are organized in the Microsoft Graph in such a way that you can traverse across and understand, for example, which devices were associated with a particular user and which chats were going on with that particular user. And maybe if you're doing some inspection of that information, you can understand whether or not there's let's say, nefarious activity that's happening where chat discussions shouldn't be happening on a device that's unmanaged or maybe is non-compliant. And then there's also just this last bit, insights, trends, and other pieces of information that show additional behavior and data that's tied to your users, documents, and all of the services. So all of these different types of information are available both from a category perspective as well as from individual users, documents, elements, and so forth. So let's say that you're interested in calling this Graph API. You're going to start with the root URL of https://graph.microsoft.com, and you're going to add some stuff to it. The first thing that we're going to add is a version, and there's only two, version 1.0 or beta. And so you're going to append / and either v10 or /beta after graph.microsoft.com. I'll give you a little sidebar on this. Right now, Intune has a lot of APIs in beta. We have quite a few that are in v10. And from the Intune perspective, both of these are fully production ready. They're scalable, they're secure, they've been fully tested. They are not experimental. They're not, trial. Beta is not kind of like a little playground. We, in fact, use beta APIs for almost all of the API calls from the console. Hopefully, we'll get them migrated to v10, but you may see, if you've looked in the documentation, you may see that beta APIs are not supported for use in production, yet Microsoft uses them for production for our console. So it's up to you as a developer to decide whether or not you're going to use v10 or beta. Sometimes the properties are only available in beta that you're interested in, and you'll need to decide to use that. But if you call support, hopefully support is going to be nice and say, yep, we'll do our best to help you out. But if you've got a bug or you have a design change request for a beta endpoint, there's no guarantee that the product group is going to take it. Whereas if you find a bug where the v10 API is not behaving as intended, then you can submit a bug for that, usually through support, and get that resolved. Okay, so side bit behind us now. The next thing that you're going to build on your API call is a specific resource. And a resource is a thing that's stored in the Graph service, and examples are users, groups, sites, drives, Intune managed devices, Intune applications, configuration policies. All of those are examples of different resources. The next thing that you can optionally list is a specific ID for the resource that you're interested in. So you can either get a list of all of the users if you just left it at graph.microsoft.com/v10/users. That would give you a list of all the users, or maybe you want a specific user's information. You can append that with an ID. You can drill in further by also asking information about a specific property that's associated with that resource. So for example, we want to get the department that Dave, who is a user in our tenant, belongs to. And you can also navigate to get additional information from related resources. So in this case, you can get a list of the security groups that Dave is a member of. So that would be an example of a navigation. And then lastly, we can add some OData query parameters to our API call. So for example, we could get the list of the top 5 security groups that Dave is a member of in this example. And we can also add a couple of key OData parameters: select, which pulls a specific property; order by, which of course sorts; filter limits the list to a specific set of objects; and expand provides additional information for related objects. So those are the basics of how you build an API to call. So here's what one looks like if it's fully formed. In order to make the call, you need to use an HTTP method, and there are 5 methods: get, post, put, patch, and delete. Get retrieves information from Graph. Post creates new information in Graph. Put also creates new information into Graph. Patch changes one or more properties of an object in Graph. And delete deletes an object out of Graph. So those are all pretty straightforward. And in order to instruct Graph what to do for your get, post, put, patch, or delete, you need to send, or you'll get back some information in JSON format. So JSON format looks pretty human readable. Starts with a curly brace and ends with a curly brace and has some name value pairs. So you've got a property name and you've got a property value, and they're comma separated. You remember when I mentioned $expand would work for this password profile. So you may have to retrieve additional data that's associated with, in this case, a user, and you could use $expand to retrieve that information. Sometimes objects will retrieve that for you. Sometimes you need to specifically call out to expand it. So going back to our diagram, if we're interested specifically in third-party apps, so you want to be able to do this automation from a third-party app, the first thing that you're going to need to do is register this application. So let's say that you're all excited about building some automation, you've got an idea for an application. The first thing that you're going to do is register that using Azure Active Directory. And you can register your application in one of two ways. A single tenant, so it applies to just the tenant that you're working with. So if you're a customer and you've got some automation you want to build, that's probably the choice you're going to make, is a single tenant application. But if you're a developer who wants to sell your application, you'll create a multi-tenant application. And that would give you a single identifier that all customers use when they register this application in their tenant. After you register the application, you have to grant it some permissions. So we've talked about things like creating an application. Well, there's a permission that sits behind Graph that allows your application to perform that action. So in this example, I've got a list of permissions. This isn't the complete list, but a snapshot of the permissions that were granted to this application. And one of them is to read Intune applications, and the other is to write applications. And for applications, these are the only two permissions that Graph exposes. This is important because if you're used to creating a role in Intune, a custom role, you'll remember that there are more permissions than just read and write. There's create, read, update, delete, and assign. And so other than read, the create, update, delete, and assign permissions are all wrapped into this read-write permission. So your application itself is going to request and be granted read-write permissions so it can perform all those operations. And lastly, for you as a customer who is going to use this application, or and it doesn't matter whether it's an application that you're using from a developer or one that you've created internally, you need to consent that that application can use the permissions that have been specified. So there's a single action, grant admin consent, for, in this case, my organization, Thunder Creek. And this is where a lot of people get tripped up, to be honest. And the reason why is because it requires a global admin to grant permissions, to grant the consent on behalf of the organization. And if you're in a large organization, you probably know that the global administrators are really picky about whatever it is that they choose to grant permissions to. Now, if you're a small company, you may be using the global administrator role to do a larger number of your tasks. But usually everybody stops for a moment and pauses and says, wait a minute, if this is a global administrator and we're granting permission, this is important, I need to pay attention. So this is a one-time operation. You do need to grant permission grant consent for the application to be able to access the data that you have in your tenant. Once that's done, and let me just kind of walk through what that looks like in the console. I've got a couple of different consoles up here. Let me see if I can find the right one. That's not it. Let's see. Let's just go. We'll go to Azure Active Directory, and we'll go to App Registrations, and I'm going to create a new registration, test app. We'll choose a single tenant, and I'm going to register this application. Once I've registered the application, I need to grant permissions. So I can add a specific permission that I want this application to use. We'll grant some delegated permissions, and we'll scroll down here to device management, manage devices. And we'll scroll down again because this UI is a little bit clunky. And we'll say, I want this application to be able to read anything about my enrolled devices. I'll add that permission, and then I'll click grant consent, and I'll choose yes. So by having done this, I've said in my organization, this application, which will have a unique identifier, has permission to read Intune devices and read user profile information. So that's what the application registration process looks like. All right, so let's continue on. And now that we understand how some of the Graph APIs are formed, how they communicate with the backend, let's give some examples of what it looks like to use them. And the first one I'm going to go through is Graph Explorer. So let's see. I've got a console open here. We'll click a list of all devices, and we'll query and get a list of devices that are enrolled in my tenant. So I've got 3 devices here. You can see I've got one that's named the same thing that's been enrolled by 2 different users. This is just kind of a holdover of the fact that I reused the same device. But what we can do, you remember, because I said anything that you can do in the UI, you can do via Graph. We can come over here to Graph Explorer, and you get this by going to developer.microsoft.com/graph, and Graph Explorer is this menu item here. I've logged in already using the same credentials, so you can see that the tenant that I'm logged in is my Thunder Creek tenant. And I can go to device management and look at managed devices. Now you notice Graph Explorer is filling in all of the different objects for me that are available for me to query. So this is a great way to figure out exactly what it is that you're interested in retrieving. I'll choose Run Query, and it will get back for us. Here's desktop D86, and here is laptop 5TL, and here again is laptop 5TL. So this information that we just did, this query, matches identical to the data that we retrieved here. This is formatted to look a little bit prettier, but this is the raw JSON information that comes back. Now you might have caught the fact that I had previously only listed device name. And so using one of those parameters, I can add $select equals, and again, I'm getting a list of the different fields that I can pull, but let's do device name. And when I run the query, now the only property that I get back is the device name. So it makes it a little bit easier for me to read only the specific properties that I'm interested in. So this is a super simple example of how to use Graph Explorer to retrieve information from Intune the same way that the Intune console does. And just to give you let's see, let me check developer tools and Graph X-Ray. Okay, so I am remembering my flow. There are developer tools that are built into the browser that let you inspect all of the API calls and traffic that are going on with this console. So let me hit F12 for developer tools. And I'm going to look at network traffic. And I'm going to just go ahead and let's click on one of these devices. So you notice over on the right-hand side, it's populating with a bunch of API calls. On the left-hand side is still our Intune console. And let's go take a look at this particular call and see what happened. By looking at the headers, you can see the request URL that was made. So this looks very similar to what we were just looking at in the Graph Explorer, device management / manage devices, but we've added a parameter here, the specific device ID that we had clicked on. So the first request that we got was a query by the console, hey, give me some more information about this device. And the response that we got back was this great big huge long string. So if we look a little bit across this string, you can see there's the last updated date timestamp, or there is a Defender scan that's pending, and that's the last time that was pending. Or maybe if we look at the number of remediated malwares, there's 0. So all of this data is contained in this view over on the left-hand side and came back as a single response to our request to get all of the details for that particular device. So this is an interesting way for you to go through, and if you click on the headers, you can look at these URLs. And this is the one way that I recommend that people use to understand exactly what the Intune console is doing, because sometimes if you go look at the reference material, you kind of throw your hands up and say, there's way too many items in this. I have no idea where to start to try to figure out how to get the data that the console is doing. F12, this is a great way for you to be able to retrieve that information specific to what you're seeing in the console. However, there's a little bit better way to do it, and that is a tool called Graph X-Ray. So if I go over to my other console, I've got the same type of information. I've got an all devices view, but I've added a Graph X-Ray as a dev tool. And Graph X-Ray is free. It's available for you to install as an extension for the Edge browser. And you can select a variety of different languages. Let's select PowerShell. And now when I click my desktop, what Graph X-Ray does for me is let me make this a little bit bigger. It takes those specific Graph API calls and translates them into, let's see if we can make this do it in, okay, here's our PowerShell. Takes those individual API calls and gives you the specific PowerShell commandlet and commands that you need to run to do exactly the same thing that you just did in the console. So if you're a great way for you to be able to understand how that Graph SDK PowerShell module would make exactly those same calls that you did through the console. So that's a little bit about Graph X-Ray. All right. The next thing is PowerShell. So we've given you a couple of tools that talk specifically about the Graph API calls themselves, but maybe you're interested in doing something with PowerShell. So from the PowerShell perspective, we have exactly what I just showed you using Graph X-Ray, where you can convert your API calls into PowerShell. But we also have the PowerShell sample scripts. So here's the repository of all of the PowerShell sample scripts. And let's go with our example of auditing. Maybe you're interested in audit events and you want to be able to retrieve a list of all the audit events. So there's a PowerShell sample script that retrieves all of those audit events, and it's the auditing_get.ps1. And when you run it, you'll get a list of categories, and then you can choose what categories you want to be able to retrieve, and you can store those then as a PowerShell object that you can then either pipe to something else, or you can just output that. So if we go look at the auditing PowerShell script, here's all 385 lines of the script. And these functions are explained for authentication, as well as the specific function for getting audit based on, or get the list of audit categories and get the list of audit events. Now, if you notice right here, the URI is the same thing that we've been looking at everywhere else. Here's graph.microsoft.com. There's a variable for the version, whether it's, in this case, it's beta, and there's a resource, in this case, device management, audit events, get audit categories. And you'll notice that the PowerShell command that's used, or commandlet that's used, is invoke REST method. And the parameters are fed to invoke REST method. So this is a great example of one of the older PowerShell command or scripts that we built before there was a Graph PowerShell SDK-based module. And our team is looking at updating these to be a little bit more modern and use the Graph SDK module instead of using the invoke REST method. But you can also see exactly for all of these different samples the specific API calls that you need to make to retrieve the audit events themselves, or the categories in this particular case. There's this is a great repository. David Falkus is the developer who put together all of these different scripts, and I'll also call your attention to the line of business application script for creating Win32 applications. This is a relatively complex process. It is not something that you can figure out on your own by doing F12 developer tools. So if you're in the if you need to create Win32 applications, this is the best reference example for how exactly to do that in PowerShell. And if you do get stuck, if you're looking at if you need additional information or details, again, reach out to me. I'd be happy to provide some additional details as well. So that's a little bit about PowerShell. So this getting started with the Graph PowerShell SDK, this is a link. I'll provide it at the end as well. But this provides some great information about using the PowerShell SDK and how to authenticate with it, how to use PowerShell module for any of the different commandlets that are available, any of the different services. I'm not going to go through it. I'm as I know Saeed said he'd love for me to spend some more time on PowerShell in the future, but I'll be honest with you, my PowerShell skills are a little bit rusty, so I will leave it as an exercise to all of you to spend the time and really dig in, especially if you're a PowerShell geek. All right, so we talked about the GitHub repo of sample scripts, and let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you may run into or get tripped up by as you're going down this adventure to automating all things Intune. The first is get versus list. And when you do a list operation, you're actually going to be using a get. So if I go back to my Graph Explorer and we go back to manage devices and we just do the query for manage devices, you're retrieving a list of all of the different managed devices that are in this particular tenant. and you're using a get call. And sometimes I'll see whether or not there's a couple of properties that return null. I'll just say in this case ICCID, UDID notes, and maybe device action results are a good example of some properties that are returned when you do a get, or excuse me, when you do a list. But there, you know that there are actually some values that are associated with this particular device. And in that case, in order to retrieve those, you need to do a get. So we've done a list. A list gives us a list of all of them. And now that I clarify the specific ID of a device that I want to retrieve, and I run that, I'm going to be performing a get. And so now you notice device action results actually return some data for me. So I oftentimes get questions, and ICCID and UDID don't show null anymore. They actually show a value, an empty value. But I oftentimes get questions from people, and you can submit doc bugs in the documentation. That's usually where I see, hey, I tried running, getting a list of all of my devices, and the device action results aren't shown for all of my devices. What in the heck is going on? And that's exactly this issue, where a list doesn't always return for you all of the details of a particular specific instance. You actually have to do a get and add the specific identifier for the object in order for all of that data to show up. And there's another little hidden piece of information here. If I do $select equals, then you'll notice there's some specific data that I can retrieve, and there's one object that is hardware information. And let's see, let me go back and take this guy out. And let me add that back in. And why am I not getting, okay. And my late afternoon brain, we'll add that. Let's do expand equals hardware information. And I'm not getting, okay. So my apologies. This is one of the pieces of data that's associated with a managed device. And I'm pretty sure, because I did this just recently, you need to do $select equals hardware information. But I'm getting an error. So there are some, the hardware information is an extra set of data that you need to specifically do the select for. And if you look in the console under hardware, that's the retrieve action that you do here. So I don't see that we got that URL with the specific information. So my apologies for the little misstep there as we were going through this. But that's a little bit about get and list and some of the things that you may run into when you're attempting to retrieve data. We talked about v1.0 versus beta and some of the differences there as it relates to the documentation that you see. So if we go to developer Microsoft.graph and we look at the API reference and we go to beta and we go to corporate management, device configuration, let's take a look at this. Here's this magic little piece of information that trips everybody up. Beta is subject to change and production use is not supported. So this is the point that most people get concerned about. And I want to encourage you to use the beta version to understand exactly all the information that's available to you. And then the second thing that I want to encourage you to do is try the V1.0 version and see whether or not that gets you everything that you need as well. That's the preference. And the one significant difference between beta and V1 for Intune, and I'm just going to say for Intune because some of the other services may treat beta as a little bit more experimental or preview of APIs. Intune considers these to be sufficient for use by our console. But the other difference is that if we need to make a breaking change, so let's say that we don't like this USB, we want to call this property or this member of an enum USB device. That would be a breaking change. And we can't make a breaking change in V1.0 without giving you 24 months notice. We can make a breaking change in beta with 3 months notice. So from a, if you're using beta APIs, just be aware that you need to take a look at the change log and make sure that any of the APIs that you're using haven't had any breaking changes in the most recent release. If you're using V1.0, chances of breaking changes coming through are pretty slim because we got to give you 24 months notice. All right, so that's a little bit about beta and V1.0. Graph permissions. You notice I talked a little bit earlier about granting permissions like application read-write, and that masks more detailed permissions like create, read, or create, update, delete, and assign. So when you're granting permissions for your application or your application needs a specific permission, and let's see if we can find where a permission is listed. Android compliance policy, get. Here are the permissions that are required for doing a get on an Android compliance policy. You need device config read or device config read write. Those permissions are broader than the permissions that you might see in Intune. So if you're using delegated authentication, and delegated means that you're logged in as a user. So when I go to this console, I am using delegated authentication. I have an app called a console, and I have a user, which is my David at Thunder Creek. So when we're using delegated authentication, both the permissions that you're granted for the app and the permissions in RBAC for the user apply. So you can, if you're thinking about how you want the security of your application to work, the preference is to provide delegated authentication, require a user to log in, and based on that user's Intune role or Azure Active Directory roles, they may be further limited to doing specific actions than the application would be limited to. So that's a little bit about graph permissions. And then admin consent is, again, kind of this notion that I mentioned earlier, that it's a one-time operation, and a lot of companies get tripped up because the global admin is the one that needs to provide consent for the application. All right, let me take just a quick drink here. I feel my throat getting dry. Okay, so moving on, we've got some basics. We've got some PowerShell commandlets that will do simple operations like create an application. We've got compliance policy. We've gone through some API calls to retrieve information, like you might want to do for reporting or showing in a simplified tool. But there are some other things that you can do that really stitch together a workflow to accomplish a much more advanced goal. So let's start out with configuration as code. So configuration as code is the idea that the text files, and we've been looking at some of the JSON output, you can output those to a text file. The idea that you treat those JSON text files the same way that you would treat code. So what I mean by that is normally when you're building a project, you've got code files that are checked in or checked out from a secure code repository. They're modified. You add new code lines, you maybe fix bugs, do whatever, you test them, and then you check back that code in using a pull request. And further, in configuration as code, you then take those files that have been checked back in and you automate the process of applying those changes to the tenant. So normally, for most organizations, you have somebody sitting at the keyboard and they're typing away at the Intune console and they're making changes and they're adding properties and they're changing settings and values and enabling things. All of that is really subject to human error. And in order to help eliminate human error from the process, configuration as code is a great way to add a bunch of validation and rigor around the process of making changes to your environment. So config as code is a combination of these three things. You have a bunch of JSON text files, which represent the change that you want to either make or your original source information that will have the change, a process for checking them in and checking them out and validating that all of those changes are correct, and then completing an entire end-to-end flow of doing, can be the checkout, the change itself, the testing and the validation, and the application of those changes to your environment. So that also, falls under DevOps. And I think I will say, at least in my discussion with a lot of Intune administrators, config as code is one of those things that of interest, but typically hasn't been implemented for Intune. There are other organizations in a company that may be doing infrastructure as code, where you're doing things like deploying a new VM, and there's an automated process for deploying a VM. You don't have somebody clicking in the console to deploy VM. So I think infrastructure as code, and to some degree configuration as code, is a little more common outside the Intune administrator's realm. So if you're part of a large organization, you might ask around and see who else has been doing config as code and what tool set they're using, because there isn't one tool set that is the tool set for configuration as code. And I know there are some customers who are using Simian Cloud. Simian Cloud is a config as code tool, and they have specific support for Intune. So I have seen that several customers are using Simian Cloud, maybe something interesting for you to take a look at. So if we go take a look at what does this look like in the Azure portal, let me see if I can find which one of mine has the Azure portal I'm interested in. It's Graph Explorer. Okay. Here it is. So I have an Azure DevOps instance that I created, and I have a specific project that I built, which is config as code. And in my configuration as code, I have a pipeline. And a pipeline is the glue that pulls together the actions that I want to perform. So when we talked about some of the different things that you would do in configuration as code, you might check out some code. You might perform a JSON validation to make sure that there weren't any typos in the JSON. You might run a PowerShell script that does further checking to see whether or not the contents of that match a security policy. Maybe you can never have a PIN less than 6 digits, and if you want to make sure that somebody hasn't made a change to the PIN policy for a device and put in 4 digits. So those are the types of things that you can do in your pipeline. And your pipeline is defined by a YAML file and runs specific actions. So I have a pipeline here. If we go look at my repo and look at the files, under my Intune device compliance, you can see I've got a YAML file for my deployment pipeline, and I've got a specific PowerShell script that runs. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about this, and the reason why is because I've got a blog post that I wrote with Nina Desnica, and Nina and I went through, and step by step, we show you how to build this Azure DevOps instance, how to add the files, how to create the pipeline, how to define the pipeline in the YAML file that runs the compliance policy and does all of the steps. So I just wanted to give you a little view of that in case you haven't seen Azure DevOps. And oh, I've of course got a pointer at the end of this to the blog post, so you have the ability to go retrieve and walk through that. And actually, if you've looked in the Intune console, if I go back to the Intune console and you go to home, right here under the Intune Customer Success blog, configuration as code for Microsoft Intune is exactly the link to the blog post that Nina and I put together. So that's, you got a shortcut now, and you don't have to wait till the end of the presentation to understand where to go take a look. All right, so that's a little bit about config as code and Azure DevOps. Let's talk about Power Automate. Power Automate is certainly has certainly gotten a lot of attention, I think, in the last year or two, as a way that's a low-code option for people to build automation on top of a whole variety of different technologies. And Intune just happens to be one of the services that is supported by Power Automate. I'll say supported, and I'll put that in quotes because Power Automate allows a flexible method for making API calls to any number of different services. And there are specific Power Automate connectors that give you exposed triggers and actions that make it much easier for you to build your Power Automate flow. Intune doesn't have a connector. So instead of using the simplified way, you have to do a little bit of extra legwork in order to make those API calls into Microsoft Graph or to use PowerShell commandlets in Power Automate. But I've got another example from one of my good friends who is Courtney Bernier. And Courtney has his own personal website, UEM for All, and he has posted a whole bunch of Power Automate flows. He loves Power Automate. And he's my go-to guy if I need to go find out something about Power Automate and Intune. But, you know, we were talking about some of the things that you can do with config as code. And one of them in config as code might be to take a device configuration profile and take it out of one tenant. Let's say that you have a test tenant that you use to do all of your validation and figure out whether or not any changes that you're going to make to a configuration profile actually work when you deploy them. But once you take that configuration profile and you validate it, you want to be able to extract it programmatically and put it into your production tenant programmatically so that you don't inadvertently miss one of the settings that you have in your config profile. So this is an example of being able to duplicate a configuration policy. And Courtney also has the configuration policy migrator, which takes the policy from one tenant and moves it to another. Now, Courtney's done something else here, which I think is just fantastic. He's also included Power Apps. So he loves building a Power App. This is a view of the Power App, and you can specify a tenant that you want to be able to migrate the policy from and to. And if you go further on down here, you can see here's the Power Automate flow that he has. and information about the Power App that was built, and lots of just great information. I think this is a really great place to start because Courtney has gone through and really provided all the details that you need and all the steps to be able to use Power Automate and also Power Apps. So that's my plug for Courtney on Power Automate. All right. And as I said, that's my favorite place for all of this. So UEM for all is a place to go. So here we are at the reference material. Here's a bunch of URLs. And again, I'll give this to Saeed so he can share it with you. And then I've got some other reference for configure as code. The blog post, we saw the pointer to that in the console. But in addition, Nina did a fantastic job of going through configuration code in Technical Takeoff. Maybe some of you had the opportunity to attend Technical Takeoff. I hope you did. And if you didn't, Technical Takeoff and all of the sections that we put together after Ignite that go through a deep dive on many of the new topics that were released as part of Ignite, as well as some topics like config as code that we wanted to give a deep dive on. All of those sessions are available at aka.ms/technical takeoff. I believe it may be tech takeoff. And there is also a large demo reel, over 3 hours of continuous demos. And I believe we also have demos for config as code included in that as well. So that's the end of my very long-winded spiel about all things graph and automation. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have, or at least give it my best shot. So you're welcome to come off mute, ask questions, or type them in chat. I've got the chat window up as well. So any things that you're interested in either spending a little bit more time or understanding more about. Okay, so Brian's got a question. I saw your note about the app sample script, so I'll take a look. Is it technically possible to export, import Intune Win32 apps through the Graph API? A quick test seems only exported, imported metadata. Intune Win is not included. This is a good example of the reason why I said reach out to me separately, Brian. The sample scripts don't show how to extract the Intune Win file and be able to then either move that over to another environment or just extract it if it were created separately and needed to do something about it. So I've got some information from our app developer that talks about the specific process that's necessary to do that. It is relatively complicated because the information that we send over is encrypted as it goes. There's some information that you need to know about the encryption algorithms that are used and so forth. So if you want to reach out to me separately, Brian, I can provide that information for you. But normally that's not something that we have as part of either the sample scripts, or it's also not included in the API documentation for doing a get on the managed app or the Intune line of business application. So thanks for the question. Anything else? All right, Frank asked, with Graph, is it possible to create a set of policies and then use it to migrate them from one tenant to another as a batch without having to adjust them? Absolutely. Let me put an asterisk at the end of that. Okay, so you can export, and actually in that PowerShell sample script repository, there are scripts that show you how to do both the export and the import. And you can put together each of the different instances of configuration profiles that you want to create in the new tenant. So you can add them together. You can either do them as a batch job. There's Graph supports a batch call, so you can append each of the individual calls that you want into a single batch call, or you can just do them one by one. You can iterate through them one by one. The caveat is this, and this is actually probably a good gotcha for everybody to understand. So when you're exporting, and maybe I can go back to my Graph Explorer here. That's not Graph Explorer. This one is Graph Explorer. So let's take a look at, if we go over to apps, let's see, maybe we have a application. I think Anatomy X has been deployed. Let's take a look. Yes. Okay. So I have an assignment for this Anatomy X application, and there is a security group that is associated with this particular deployment. The security group is called HL1 for Joe. And if I were to go look at my groups, you can see there is, if we look for HL1 for Joe, this is the security group, and it has a specific object ID. This is also what you can use when you're querying for this security group in Graph. Let's see if we can go to groups, paste that in, and here is HL1 for Joe. So this unique security group is associated with our assignment for our Anatomy X application. When you export this application, or in your case, a configuration profile, or whatever set of policies, you can also export the assignment. And when you export the assignment, you're going to get the security group identifier for HL1 for Joe. And that's from the tenant that you're exporting from. Now, you may have created a security group called HL1 for Joe in your other tenant, but the underlying identifier for that is always going to be unique across tenants. So you're never going to find this identifier for a security group in the world. There's only one, and it's in my tenant. So if you were to export out the assignments, then you would need to identify the destination security group identifier that you want to include in your assignment in the destination. So that's why I said, Frank, there's an asterisk next to, yes, it's possible to create policies and use them to migrate from one tenant to another as a batch. You can do that, but there are properties like the identifier which are unique in each tenant, and you need to be able to specify those. There's also a couple of properties that don't make sense to migrate. So again, if we were to look at, let's say that you wanted to migrate this security group, the created date timestamp is not something that you can migrate. So there's a bunch of read-only properties that are associated with most all objects. And even in the case of a configuration profile, there'll be a created date timestamp for that configuration profile. And that's a read-only property that you can't update when or you can't even specify it when you're creating that new profile, or that profile in the new tenant or the destination tenant. So you will get this property when you do an export, but you'll need to do some cleanup when you do the import. And that cleanup is, again, along the lines of removing any unique security group identifiers or read-only properties. If we go take a look at the Intune sample scripts let's go take a look at compliance policy. So I have compliance policy. There's an import from JSON, which will take our JSON output and import that definition of a compliance policy into a tenant. And if I remember right, somewhere around line 328 is an example of how the PowerShell doesn't include things like the created date time or the last modified date time stamp or the version or the ID. So here we're going to create some specific JSON text. We're going to convert it from JSON, and we're going to exclude some properties because those properties are read-only properties and will return an error if you attempt to set those property values when you're doing your import from JSON. So those are the gotchas, but otherwise that is completely possible for you to do. And also in the config as code, we touch on this same exact principle, and I call out this exact same example here on line 328 where we exclude some properties. So hopefully that answers your question, Frank. Anything else?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Dave, I am personally extremely impressed. That deep knowledge is simply awesome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's one of my passion areas, so I'm always happy to talk to all things graph.
Awesome. Let me stop the recording.